100 years ago, it moved across a small town, creating a terror that no human being should ever live to see again. Now it has returned. Bolt your doors. Lock your windows. There's something in John Carpenter's The Fog. Let's set the table. The coastal town of Antonio Bay in Northern California is set to celebrate its 100th anniversary, and local historian Mr. Matchin is telling ghost stories to a group of children out on the beach. One of the stories concerns a ship that crashed against the rocks 100 years ago, killing everyone on board. Paranormal activity begins to erupt around the town, and in the church, Father Malone discovers his grandfather's diary. The journal reveals that in 1880, the 6 founders of Antonio Bay, including Father Malone's grandfather, deliberately sank a clipper ship called the Elizabeth Dane in order to prevent the ship's wealthy owner, Captain Blake, from founding a leper colony nearby. These good folk used gold plunder from the ship not only to found Antonio Bay, but to create a large golden cross that they would bury in the walls of the church. For what reason? I don't know. From there, a strange glowing fog envelops the waters off Antonio Bay, carrying with it the recommissioned Elizabeth Dane, plus Captain Blake and his vengeful crew. In addition to Father Malone, the cast of characters we meet includes local DJ Stevie Wayne, town resident / rando Nick Castle, a hitchhiker named Elizabeth Sully, and in charge of putting on Antonio Bay's 100th anniversary party, Kathy Williams. The group spends the film putting the pieces together Scooby-Doo style until they figure out that Captain Blake has returned to run swords through warm bodies. 6 to be exact, and not one less will do. More than just a meteorological phenomenon, here are 5 wicked things shrouded in the fog. Let's start with Stevie Wayne, played by actress Adrienne Barbeau. While The Fog is an ensemble piece, we identify the most with Stevie because she's the only character given any sort of backstory, and the only one who's got any real skin in the game. We know she's a DJ who works out of a lighthouse, so right there she has the coolest job on the planet, even though she does tend to favor some pretty innocuous and sleepy cocktail jazz. We also know that she's a single mom, balancing late nights on the airwaves with keeping a watchful eye on her son. After all, she wouldn't want the little bastard to come home after a morning of unsupervised play down by the beach with a piece of cursed driftwood, now would she? As the DJ in a lighthouse, she's in the unique position to not only watch the events of the fog unfold, but to then advise the people in the town to get to the church and hopefully to safety. It's also from this vantage point that Stevie's desperation grows as she begs her listeners to save her son as she sees the fog get closer and closer to her home. I also think that Stevie Wayne, with a little reinterpretation, is one of the best final girls of the 80s. While her single mom status means she's no virgin, between the job and her son, she does take on the traditional final girl trait of avoiding any sort of fornicational type activities unless you include flirting with the local weatherman. Like most final girls, she's socially set apart from her peers and is even a bit of a tomboy. Lastly, she's smart, curious, and vigilant. She fires up the lighthouse generator when the fog takes out the power in the entire town. As a DJ, she runs point for Antonio Bay when the fog hits, trying her best to direct people to safety. Lastly, in the true climax of the film, she fights off multiple worm-faced ghosts from on top of the lighthouse and lives to tell the tale. That's what makes her a survivor and a true horror heroine, right up there with Laurie Strode and Ellen Ripley. The work beer. Is there anything better than leaving work for lunch and finding a place to have a beer or a mixed drink while you take a look at the menu? Well, there is something better, and that's when you order another drink while you wait for your food to arrive. And then, of course, you have another when the food does arrive. Hell, pretty soon it's 2:30, 3 o'clock. You're sitting there by yourself, ignoring emails and looking at memes. If you ever find yourself in a situation like this, don't feel bad, because apparently this is how people rolled in Antonio Bay in the 1980s. Damn near everyone in this film is drinking on the job. First we see John Carpenter in a cameo as the church custodian. And what's he cleaning up? Empty can. Shortly thereafter we meet Hal Holbrook's Father Malone, who, like all good men of the cloth, is about to have himself a little extra sip of the sacrament before he discovers his grandfather's diary. Cut to the three fishermen of the seagrass. These dudes are fishing at night, ignoring their significant others, and pulling beers below decks when the Elizabeth Dane and crew arrive to crash the party. Then there's Tom Atkins as Nick Castle, who's down in some road sodas when he's driving home at night and decides to double down on his questionable lifestyle choices by picking up Jamie Lee Curtis's hitchhiker Elizabeth. Good luck explaining to your insurance how those empty beer cans had nothing to do with your windshield inexplicably shattering. So is it any surprise that when the fog really hits the fan, that the town bar becomes the de facto command center? Not the church, the town bar. I mean, up until this 100-year curse, the people of Antonio Bay were basically living in a Jimmy Buffett song. So, imagine writing the most memorable horror theme of all time. One that more kids will know how to play on the piano than chopsticks. Now imagine sitting in front of the keyboard to write the score for the movie that comes after that one. Luckily for us, John Carpenter didn't let writing the score to Halloween intimidate him when he sat down at the keyboard to write the score for The Fog, because this is some of his best work. Being that a lot of his early work is low on budget and high on DIY, Carpenter looked at scoring as just another element of the filmmaking process that he could handle himself without having to hire a professional film composer. Now, if it weren't for the fact that he was working in genre, it's likely the studios wouldn't have given Carpenter such free rein when it came to the scores. Either way, the hallmarks of John Carpenter's classic film scoring are all on display in The Fog. The sparse textures and drones that mirror the omnipresent nature of the fog are often slightly detuned for an unsettling effect. The pulsing that accompanied Michael Myers in Halloween is back in The Fog to deliver the same message. This is an unstoppable force that is coming for you, and it will not be escaped from. And finally, the repetition of the two main themes from The Fog. It's worth noting that Carpenter writes very few themes for his movies, but does remix and reconfigure them to great effect depending on the scene. The main theme itself is a minor key piano motif that is then echoed on a synth immediately after. It's as if the piano represents the 1880 sinking of the Elizabeth Dane, and the synth is the 1980 return of Captain Blake and his ghostly crew. All in all, the score is classic Carpenter. While Halloween before it was all rapid stabs at the keyboard, the music for The Fog is layered and descends, just like the fog itself. Now, Carpenter's original cut of The Fog left him feeling underwhelmed and dissatisfied. In his words, he didn't have a movie there. Adding to his despair was the feeling that the game had changed since Halloween, and that a slow burn atmospheric ghost story might not cut it with audiences expecting more gore and gruesome deaths to scare them out of their seats. So Carpenter famously went back and did reshoots on The Fog, upping the gore with more realistic sword decapitations and boat hooks catching flesh. He added the scene in the hospital where an eyeless corpse from the seagrass is momentarily reanimated. Now I can't imagine The Fog without the set-piece confrontation on top of the lighthouse between Stevie Wayne and the ghost that Carpenter lovingly refers to as Wormface. But this too was added in reshoots. To round it all out, Carpenter went back and added traditional stingers to the score in order to increase the amount of jump scares in the film. These reshoots provided the scares Carpenter was after without getting in the way of the ethereal, atmospheric ghost story he set out to tell. Now, The Fog is by no means a slasher, but with the gore and brutality added in the reshoots, it's definitely not your typical ghost story either. With the reshoots, the ghosts in The Fog are more apt to run a sword through you than to push your furniture around in the middle of the night. The Fog is filled with classic images, many of which are the direct result of Carpenter's decision to film in anamorphic widescreen Panavision. This served to not only mask the meager $1 million budget that Carpenter was working with, but to illustrate the vast distances that the fog was covering and the isolation of its characters. There are some incredible widescreen location shots throughout the film. The shot of Stevie Wayne descending the stairs, all 313 of them to start her shift at the lighthouse, is absolutely Hitchcockian and serves to enshrine radio station KAB as one of horror's most recognizable and hallowed locations. Later in the film, the widescreen aspect ratio serves to further illustrate the unnatural nature of the fog as it travels across great distances to envelop the town of Antonio Bay. Armed with a few practical effects and copious amounts of craft and ingenuity, these shots of the fog barreling through Antonio Bay never look cheap or gimmicky, and are certainly nothing less than terrifying. So let's make it a double. What would make a good double feature with the fog? For my money, and after careful consideration of several options, I think Jaws would be the perfect double feature. The reason I'm choosing Jaws is because both films center around a small community along the water celebrating some type of holiday. In the case of Jaws, it's the 4th of July, the big money maker for Amity Island. And in the case of the fog, it's the 100th year anniversary, the centennial of the town's founding. Both movies also feature an omnipresent, unstoppable force, bringing death and wreaking havoc on the local population. Lastly, the evil in both films never falters up until the very last desperate seconds. There is no back and forth trading of blows in the fog or Jaws. The evil is unrelenting in its pursuit of a primal purpose. So ideally you've got the whole Saturday to do your double feature, and you start off Jaws in the afternoon, drink some beers, grill some weenies, maybe some lobster tail if you're feeling really culinarily accurate and ambitious. Hell, go nuts and do a clam bake. Then, just as near dark approaches, you start watching the fog, and you try and match the residents of Antonio Bay drink for drink. I dare you. So, hot take for the fog, PJ Soles would have been a better Elizabeth than Jamie Lee Curtis. Now, I know it's sacrilege to speak any ill of the Queen, and I'm not saying that Jamie Lee Curtis's performance in The Fog is bad. I'm saying she was miscast. The problem is, this role doesn't play to Jamie Lee Curtis's strengths. Starting with Laurie Strode in Halloween, Jamie Lee Curtis exudes an air of headstrong independence and focus, and that same self-sure determination is present in just about every other Jamie Lee Curtis role, except for Elizabeth in The Fog. She's hitchhiking down the coast of California, looking for whatever adventure might fall in her lap, or whatever lap she might have an adventure in. In The Fog, the role asks for very little except to scream at the right moments, be terrified, and be arm candy for the Nick Castle character. In reality, that's just not enough for Jamie Lee Curtis to make this character memorable or even appealing to the audience. There is, however, another Halloween alum that would have totally brought some bounce, fun, and levity to the role. In the 70s and early 80s, Soles absolutely owned the bouncy, curious, fun-loving female role she was playing. Just watch her in Carrie or Rock and Roll High School or Stripes, and I think you'll agree that she would have brought more levity and charm and likability to the role of Elizabeth in The Fog. So what do you think? Is this a great Jamie Lee Curtis role and I'm just not seeing it? Do you love The Fog? Do you hate The Fog? Did I miss touching on your favorite thing about The Fog? Let me know in the comments section, and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any more hot takes or wicked things about your favorite horror movies. Forward and onward.